My name is Kolankiewicz. I am a wildlife biologist and environmental planner. I got a bachelor's degree at Virginia Tech. During that time, I worked quite a bit for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. From there, I went on to get my master's degree in environmental planning at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And from there on up to Alaska, where I spent the next 4 years working for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game out in the wilderness. In the early 90s, I used to give a lot of talks in Southern California to Sierra Club and other environmental and conservation organizations. One of the things I always used to open my talks with was a discussion of population and just how important human population size was in the attributes, the environmental attributes of an area, how much space and resources there were left for wildlife and wilderness. What made me realize this was the 3-year stint I made as a Peace Corps volunteer in Central America, in the country of Honduras. I was living in a country trying to protect its resources under ever greater strains and stresses. At the same time, the country is staggering under the weight of so many people. Its classrooms would have 50 and 70 kids. They can't afford books for them. Economic growth was falling behind population growth. Even at that time, before I'd come back to the United States, I realized, boy, this is an unsustainable situation. Something isn't right about this. In the early 1970s, the journal Science published an article that introduced an equation called the IPAT equation. I is equal to PAT. That is, if you multiply the size of the population times level of affluence of that population, times the technology that delivers that given per capita consumption or affluence, you get a rough idea of what the environmental impact is going to be. That, for many of us in the population field, has been sort of our E is equal to MC squared equation. Through the 1960s into the 70s, the US population was still growing pretty quickly at that time, approximately 2.5 million people a year, 2 to 2.5 million people a year, which was of great concern to those of us who wanted to protect the environment and conserve natural resources in the United States. Meantime, the world population was growing on the order of 90 million a year. If you put it in terms of this IPAT equation I mentioned a few minutes ago, the impact of the American growth was much greater because of our much higher levels of per capita consumption and technology. That is, the average American would be consuming anywhere between 10 to 100 times as much as a person in a developing country, depending on what part of the world they were in. The United States, as a matter of fact, reached replacement level fertility, or a TFR, total fertility rate of 2.1 in 1973. We crossed that threshold. What that meant was that if we maintained neutrality in immigration, that is, emigration, people leaving the country equaled immigration, people entering the country, you would have population stabilization or stability in the United States. What has happened since then? We have actually added another 100 million Americans. Most of that population growth, on the order of 2/3 to 3/4 of it, is driven by immigration right now in any given year. Roy Beck and I have done some studies together to try and quantify what the impact of these increasing numbers is, overall aggregate population growth on the country is. And we learned that about half of sprawl in the United States is due to population growth. Well, that's half of what most environmentalists and a lot of Americans would consider to be a major problem facing the country: the loss of open space, the loss of countryside, cities that never seem to stop growing. If you look at other things that are topical and timely nowadays, energy consumption, oil imports, greenhouse gas emissions, population, if anything, is an even greater factor. Virtually all of the increase in our greenhouse gas emissions, say from 1970 to the present, from 1990 to the present, any time frame you choose, is attributable to population growth. We are no longer increasing our per capita energy consumption. That has been stable or stagnant or actually been reduced, depending on what type of energy resource you look at, for 20 or 30 years now. If you look at oil imports, I can safely say that we wouldn't even need any oil from the very turbulent Middle East if it weren't for the 100 million people that we'd added since 1970. I see the immigration and even the population questions as part of a much larger quest for environmental and ecological sustainability in this country and on this planet. How we get from here to there is not an easy question to answer, but certainly having immigration levels that are 4 times that of historic ones are not a step in the right direction. One of the titles I see in the bookstore here is An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. An inconvenient truth that a lot of environmentalists seem to be unwilling to acknowledge is that it's population growth driving the increase in our greenhouse gas emissions. Whether or not environmentalists want to face up to it, immigration is part of that equation.